You cross an invisible line in the Caucasus Mountains, and suddenly everything you thought you knew about Europe, Asia, and identity begins to blur. Because Georgia is a country that refuses to sit still on a map or in history books. A place where medieval stone towers watch over Soviet apartment blocks, where church bells echo beside techno clubs at dawn, and where the simple question, "Where are you from?" can spark an hour-long debate that no one truly wins. And that confusion is exactly where this story begins. High above winding mountain roads where clouds roll like slow oceans over ancient valleys, and the land itself seems to whisper that it has been conquered, claimed, renamed, and reborn more times than anyone can count. Because Georgia is not just a destination, it is an argument, one fought with wine glasses, prayer candles, protest signs, and stubborn pride. A country that some call European, others call Asian, and Georgians themselves often describe as something else entirely, a crossroads that never chose a single direction and paid dearly for it. And to understand why Georgia is Europe's most confusing country, you have to move backward through time, long before borders were drawn with rulers and treaties, back to when this land was known as Colchis and Iberia, names that sound mythical because they almost are. Kingdoms tied to legends like the Golden Fleece, where Greek myths placed heroes and monsters at the edge of the known world, a clue that even then Georgia existed on the margins of definition. Close enough to Europe to inspire its imagination, yet distant enough to feel exotic and unknowable. And that tension between belonging and otherness has never left. Not through Roman influence, not through Persian domination, not through Arab invasions, and not through the long shadow of the Ottoman and Russian empires that pulled Georgia in opposite directions like a fragile thread stretched between two giants. Because geography here is destiny. The Caucasus Mountains acting as both shield and prison, protecting valleys from complete erasure while isolating them just enough to develop fiercely independent identities, languages and traditions that refuse to be simplified, and nowhere is that stubborn uniqueness clearer than in the Georgian language itself. A script so distinct it looks almost artistic, flowing like carved vines across stone walls, belonging to no other language family in Europe or Asia, as if the people here decided long ago that even their words would stand alone. And when Christianity arrived in the 4th century, making Georgia one of the earliest Christian nations on earth, it anchored that uniqueness even deeper, because faith here was not just spiritual but political, a declaration of alignment with a Christian Europe at a time when surrounding powers followed different gods. And that decision shaped centuries of conflict and loyalty, churches carved into cliffs, monasteries perched on mountains, and a national story built around survival through belief. Yet despite this early Christian identity, Georgia was never fully embraced by Europe, always considered too distant, too eastern, too complicated. And when waves of empire rolled through, Georgian kings and queens walked a tightrope of alliances, sometimes leaning west, sometimes east, always trying to preserve autonomy in a region where autonomy was a luxury few could afford. And this constant balancing act hardened the national character, creating a culture that values hospitality almost aggressively, where strangers are treated like family, tables overflow with food and wine, and toasts stretch into philosophy lectures delivered by a tamada who speaks with the authority of a poet and the stubbornness of a general. Because in Georgia, hospitality is not politeness. It is survival turned into ritual, a way of saying we are still here, we still matter. And we will tell our own story, even if history keeps interrupting. And that story took a sharp turn in the 19th century when Georgia was absorbed into the Russian Empire. A moment that still divides opinion today, because Russian rule brought modernization, roads, education, and a connection to a broader European intellectual world. But it also stripped Georgia of sovereignty, embedding a complex relationship that would later explode into resentment, nostalgia, and resistance, especially during the Soviet era when Georgia became both a jewel and a prison within the USSR, producing figures like Stalin, while simultaneously suffering under the system he helped build, and walking through Tbilisi. Today, you can still feel that contradiction, ornate balconies leaning over narrow streets, crumbling Soviet buildings patched with satellite dishes, graffiti layered over imperial facades, a city that feels unfinished in the most honest way possible, as if every era left something behind and no one ever quite cleaned up. And yet this chaos somehow works because Georgia thrives in contradiction, blending ancient traditions with sudden bursts of modern rebellion. And nowhere was that rebellion louder than after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when independence brought hope and hardship in equal measure. The 1990s marked by economic collapse, civil conflict, and the painful reality that freedom does not arrive with instructions. And while many countries rushed westward with clear plans, Georgia stumbled, torn between Russian influence and European aspiration, a tension that erupted violently in the early 2000s and again in 2008, when war with Russia over South Ossetia and Abkhazia froze parts of the country in unresolved limbo, territories internationally recognized as Georgian, yet effectively beyond its control, creating physical scars that mirror the psychological ones. Because how do you define a nation when pieces of it exist in political uncertainty, when borders shift depending on who you ask, and when identity feels constantly under negotiation? And yet, despite these fractures, or perhaps because of them, Georgia doubled down on its European dream, waving EU flags alongside its own, rewriting laws, reforming institutions, and telling the world that it belongs to Europe not just geographically, but culturally and morally, even as critics argue that Europe has been slow to fully accept it, leaving Georgia suspended in a waiting room of promises and partnerships. And this waiting has fueled a new generation of Georgians who grew up post-Soviet, who dance to electronic music in repurposed factories, protest corruption in the streets, and argue fiercely online about tradition versus progress, faith versus freedom, East versus West, all while knowing that their country's story cannot be reduced to a single answer. And if you pause here for a second, if you're enjoying this journey through a country that refuses to be labeled, do me a favor and like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that bell notification so you don't miss the next story that will probably also confuse you in the best possible way. Because trust me, if geography were a personality test, Georgia would be the one that refuses to pick just one option and somehow circles them all. And as we move beyond politics into the landscape itself, the confusion deepens, because Georgia looks like several countries stitched together. From the subtropical Black Sea coast, where palm trees line boulevards and Soviet-era resorts decay beside luxury hotels, to the wine valleys of Kakheti, where clay qvevri are buried underground in techniques unchanged for thousands of years, to the highlands of Svaneti, where medieval towers rise against snow-covered peaks like something pulled from a fantasy novel. And wine here is not just a drink, but a claim to civilization, with Georgians proudly arguing that they invented wine 8,000 years ago, a statement backed by archaeology and delivered with a smile that dares you to disagree. Because in Georgia, pride is rarely quiet, and this pride extends to food that refuses compromise, heavy with walnuts, garlic, herbs, and spices that feel both comforting and challenging. Dishes meant to be shared, debated, argued over, because meals here are social performances, reflections of a culture that believes life should be loud, emotional, and deeply human. And yet, beneath the warmth, there is anxiety, a sense that the future is uncertain, that alliances can shift, that history might repeat itself, and that confusion might once again turn dangerous. And this anxiety fuels the question at the heart of Georgia's story. Is it European because it wants to be, because it shares Christian roots and democratic aspirations, or is it something else entirely, a Caucasian civilization with its own gravitational pull, too unique to fit neatly into categories invented elsewhere? And the answer depends entirely on who you ask and when you ask them, because Georgia is not static, it is a living argument evolving in real time. And perhaps that is why it fascinates outsiders so deeply, because in a world obsessed with clear labels and simple narratives, Georgia dares to remain unresolved. Let's look closer at the lives and symbols that carry this forward. Because if Georgia teaches us anything, it's that identity is not always about choosing sides. Sometimes it's about standing in the middle and daring the world to understand you. Svaneti's stone towers stand like sentinels, family fortresses against raids, proof that survival here was communal, stubborn, and carved high into snow country. Monasteries cling to rock, mixing prayer with watchfulness, faith as shelter and a quiet signal toward Europe beyond these ridges. In Clay Cuvevri, wine ferments underground, the world's oldest method, patience buried in earth and poured as everyday memory. At the Supra, the Tamada guides toasts, love, ancestors, peace. Words become duty, and hospitality becomes a shield. Even the alphabet resists imitation. Curves cut in stone, language as homeland when borders shifted like sand. Panel blocks and satellite dishes recall harder decades. Georgia wears history on balconies, yet keeps looking outward. Georgian and EU flags rise together, a promise pursued despite setbacks, argued fiercely and peacefully in the streets. A new generation remixes factories into dance floors. Tradition negotiated to a brighter beat, not abandoned. Vineyards sweep across Kakheti. Families measure years by harvests, exporting a flavor older than most nations. Above it all, the Caucasus breathes. Borders seem small beneath the ridges that shaped every choice. Candles warm frescoed walls, quiet faith steadying a noisy century. Tbilisi's balconies lean like neighbors. The city talks, argues, forgives, and keeps moving. So Georgia stays proudly unresolved. European, Asian, Caucasian, simply Georgian. As the sun settles over Tbilisi's hills and lights bloom like scattered constellations, Georgia's story gathers into one clear truth. Its confusion is a kind of strength, a refusal to be simplified, shaped on the edge of empires, yet never erased. If this journey shifted how you see a country, stay with us. Like the video, subscribe, and tap the bell so you'll catch the next story that gently challenges certainty.